When I look back at the past, which seems so simple, so harmless, I can't help but wonder, where exactly did things go wrong? This feeling, like a whisper in the night, fills me with anxiety and longing. My name is Ellie. I'm 24 years old. I live in a quiet town in the state of Michigan. From early childhood, I was a daddy's girl. Mom left when I was just 3 years old, taking with her the warmth and comfort of maternal love. Only Dad and I were left, John, my only support in this world. He was always everything to me. While other children might complain about strict or cold fathers, I knew I was lucky. John was caring, kind, and patient. He taught me everything, from riding a bike to reading complex novels. His hands were strong, but there was always a gentleness in them when he rocked me to sleep or comforted me in difficult moments. Our home was small but cozy, old but reliable. Every room held its memories. The kitchen where Dad made his signature pancakes in the mornings, the living room where we watched movies, wrapped in the same blanket. For the two of us, this place was the whole world. But everything changed when I turned 18. That year, I got into a university in another city. I remember standing at the door, holding a suitcase in my hands, and Dad struggling to hide his emotions. His voice trembled when he said, "You must remember, Ellie, that I am always here. At any moment. Just call." It was a turning point, the first step into the big world where new challenges, people, and experiences awaited me. And yet I remember how my heart ached when I first left home, left Dad alone. His gaze followed me, as if he was afraid that at that moment something would change forever. Life at the university was new and vibrant. Lectures, dormitories, parties, everything seemed so interesting, full of life. But despite all this, I often missed home. Moments when I lay in bed, exhausted after a long day, and looked at the ceiling were the most painful. I thought about Dad, about how he probably watched TV alone, cooked dinner just for himself. His sad eyes, always reflecting love for me, never left my thoughts. The first year of university flew by quickly. I had changed, it was obvious. From a shy girl who was afraid to take a step into the unknown, to a person who openly accepted life as it was. I learned to have fun, to drink, to dance until dawn. University life taught me a lot, but it also distanced me from those roots that always held me. Or maybe it just seemed that way. When the summer holidays arrived, I returned home. I remember entering the house with a suitcase in hand, ready to feel like that little girl again who could always find comfort in Dad's embrace. But something was different. Not the house, not Dad, but me. When I saw him sitting in the living room, focused on the TV, my heart filled with joy. I decided to sneak up to scare him, but he noticed me right away through the old mirror hanging on the wall. We both laughed, as if those months of separation had never happened. His embrace was warm, but something inside me was no longer the same. That night, over dinner, we shared stories. He laughed when I told him about funny situations in the dorm, and looked at me with love when I mentioned my new friends. But at some point, I caught myself unable to look away from his face. John had always been a handsome man, but only now did I notice how strong and confident he looked. His muscles, which he maintained through work and sports, seemed surprisingly expressive. It was a strange, embarrassing feeling that I tried to shake off. "You've changed a lot, Ellie," he said with a smile when I finished my story. I nodded, smiling back. "And you're still the same, Dad," I replied, trying not to show my confusion. That night I lay in my room for a long time, staring at the ceiling. Thoughts swirled in my head, giving me no peace. I remembered how he looked at me, his voice, his manners. These were the same things I had seen all my life, but now I looked at them differently. Why? What had changed? Anxiety began to grow inside me. This feeling, strange and unfamiliar, made me doubt myself. And yet I couldn't get these thoughts out of my head. I woke up early in the morning, when the light was barely filtering through the curtains. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. These walls, which I had known since childhood, seemed both familiar and alien to me. I got up, stretched, and went to the window. Summer in Michigan was always hot, but today the heat seemed suffocating from dawn. In the kitchen, Dad was already preparing breakfast. The smell of toasted bread and coffee awakened my appetite. But even more, I was drawn to his voice humming a melody. His voice was warm as always, and reminded me of the lullabies he sang when I was a child. I stopped in the doorway watching him. His movements were confident, every detail thought out. He seemed not to notice me. "Good morning, sleepyhead," he said without turning around, as if sensing my presence. I smiled, came closer, and hugged him. The warmth of his body was strangely soothing, but I felt that same anxiety again as I had the night before. Something inside me was awakening, something I couldn't understand. After breakfast, the day dragged on lazily. The heat became unbearable, and I decided to take a shower to cool off. I took a towel and headed to the bathroom. The water ran cold and scalding at the same time. I closed my eyes, letting the drops wash away the accumulated fatigue. It was almost meditative. But soon I felt a strange tension, as if someone was watching me. The feeling was so strong that I opened my eyes. The door was not fully closed, and I saw Dad's silhouette. His gaze caught me off guard. There was something in his eyes that I couldn't describe. It was not just the look of a father at his daughter. It was something else. I froze, unable to move. The water continued to flow over my skin, but the cold I had felt before disappeared. Instead, I felt hot, unbearably hot. Our eyes met. For a moment, we stood still like two people who suddenly realized they had come too close to the edge. "Dad," I managed to say, my voice trembling. He flinched as if waking from a trance. Quickly averting his gaze, he muttered something like an apology and left. I stood there, my heart pounding, my thoughts a chaotic whirlwind. What had just happened? Why didn't I stop him? Why didn't I even feel afraid? I came out of the bathroom sometime later, wrapped in a towel. Steam filled the room, mixing with the hot air of the house. When I entered the living room, Dad was sitting on the couch, his eyes glued to the TV screen, but his posture betrayed tension. I couldn't take my eyes off him. "Dad, are you okay?" I asked, sitting down next to him. He nodded without looking at me. His hand nervously fiddled with the TV remote, and his face was strangely flushed. At that moment, I realized that something had appeared between us that couldn't be ignored. I felt that his gaze kept returning to me, even though he desperately tried not to show it. I smiled, trying to lighten the mood. "You know, you're acting strangely today," I said half-jokingly. His gaze lingered on me a little longer than it should have. "I'm just tired, Ellie," he replied, but his voice wavered. We both were silent for a while. The space between us became thick, like the air before a storm. We both knew that the boundaries were beginning to blur, but neither of us dared to speak about it aloud. Later that evening, lying in my room, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Why didn't I feel anger or disgust? Why did this strange tension between us not seem so wrong to me? My heart raced as I remembered his eyes, his voice, his hesitation. It was a struggle between reason and feelings, a struggle I couldn't win. I was scared, but not of what was happening, but of the fact that I didn't want to resist it. That night it was hard to fall asleep. The ceiling above my bed seemed endless, as if looking back at my thoughts, tangled and anxious. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that everything that had happened over the past few days was just my fantasies. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, the strange feeling inside only grew stronger. The next morning, I decided to focus on ordinary things. Routine tasks, making breakfast, cleaning the room, going to the store, should have distracted me. But even when I was choosing products in the supermarket, I couldn't get Dad's face out of my head. His gaze, so deep and penetrating, haunted me. When I returned home, Dad was in the garage working on repairing the old car. This was his favorite way to distract himself from worries. He always said that cars are simpler than people. They either work or they don't. I approached closer, watching his focused movements. His hands were stained with oil, but this only emphasized his confidence and strength. "You're home," he said without looking up. "Yes. Are you still tinkering with this car?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He smiled. "It's my way of relaxing." I sat down on an old box nearby, watching him. His t-shirt was soaked with sweat, revealing strong muscles. The sunlight fell on his face, highlighting the wrinkles that had appeared over the years of worries. This seemingly ordinary image for some reason attracted me. We talked about trivial things, the weather, plans for dinner, neighbors. But the tension hidden behind these words became more and more palpable. At some point he stopped and looked at me. His gaze lingered a little longer than necessary. "Ellie, is everything okay?" he asked. I nodded, although my head was a complete mess. "Of course. Why do you ask?" He paused for a moment as if choosing his words. "You've changed. I don't know how to explain it, but you're not the same girl who went to university." His words stung, but not in the way I expected. They made me think. Yes, I had changed. But had something changed in him? Or were these just my feelings that had become stronger? Later that evening, I made a decision. We couldn't keep pretending that nothing was happening. These looks, the tension, the strange moments, all of it couldn't be ignored. I had to talk to him. When dinner was over, I gathered my courage. "Dad, can we talk?" I asked, pushing my plate aside. He looked slightly surprised but nodded. "Of course. What's wrong?" I took a deep breath. "I feel like something has changed between us. I can't explain it, but I know you feel it too." His face changed. He looked like I had said something he himself was afraid of. "Ellie," he began, but his voice wavered. "Don't deny it, Dad," I interrupted. "I see how you look at me, and you see how I look at you. This isn't how it should be. But I can't control it." Silence hung between us, so thick it felt tangible. I felt his hand tremble slightly as he took my hand in his. His eyes, full of fear, love, and confusion, met mine. "I don't want you to feel this way," he said finally. "But I can't deny that I think about it too. It's wrong, Ellie. We can't." His voice trailed off, and I realized he couldn't finish the sentence. Because the words he was about to say were the truth, but also a lie. We both knew that we had crossed a boundary that no longer existed. I lowered my head, feeling tears well up in my eyes. "I don't know what to do with this," I whispered. He was silent for a long time, then stood up and came closer to me. His embrace was as warm as always, but this time it didn't comfort. It only intensified the storm raging inside me. "Ellie, we'll figure this out. Together," he said, but I heard uncertainty in his voice. That night I lay awake again. This time, instead of the ceiling, I saw his eyes in front of me, full of feelings he tried to hide. I knew we could never be the same again. The next day, everything was different. Our home, once cozy and familiar, now seemed too small, the walls closing in around us. I felt his presence in everything. In every sound, in every movement. Making coffee in the morning turned into a trial when he entered the kitchen. Our eyes met and I felt the blood rush to my face. "Good morning," he said, his voice too calm, as if he was trying to hide the inner tension. "Morning," I replied, trying to focus on the cup in my hands, but my fingers trembled. He sat down at the table, and I felt his gaze slide over me. I pretended not to notice, but inside I was burning. We tried to act as if everything was normal, but it was just a thin veil. We both knew it was about to tear. After breakfast, I went to my room. I thought that solitude would help me sort myself out, but my thoughts only became more complicated. I remembered every detail of our recent conversations, every word, every look. These moments wouldn't let go of me. Why couldn't I go back to what it was before? Why did I allow myself to feel this? A few hours later, I heard his voice. He was fixing something in the garage, and his low, focused tone reached me. I went to the window and saw him through the glass. He was working with some tool, his movements confident and precise. The sun fell on his shoulders, bare under a simple white t-shirt. I lingered longer than I should have. Guilt washed over me, but along with it came something else. A strange, uncontrollable desire. I clenched my fists, trying to drive these thoughts away. This was wrong. This wasn't what I should be thinking about. But no matter how hard I tried, these thoughts kept coming back. They grew stronger, turning my inner resistance into a barely noticeable obstacle. I knew that crossing this boundary would be the beginning of the end, but I couldn't stop myself. That evening, I heard him come into the house. His steps were slow, as if he was lost in thought. I sat in the living room pretending to read a book, but my attention was on him. "How was your day?" I asked when he sat down across from me. "Not bad." "And yours?" he replied. Our conversation was ordinary, but the tension in the air was almost palpable. When I looked up, our eyes met. It was more than just a look. It was a moment when everything we tried to hide surfaced. "Ellie," he began, but fell silent as if he didn't know how to continue. I put down the book and looked at him. "You feel it too, don't you?" I asked softly. He closed his eyes as if trying to escape my words. "It's wrong," he said, but his voice trembled. "Then why can't we stop it?" I felt my voice becoming more confident, even though everything inside me was shaking. He stood up, paced around the room, as if trying to find a way out of the situation, out of the house, out of this moment. But there was no way out. He turned to me, his eyes full of emotions. "Do you understand what we're doing?" he asked, his voice full of despair. But I saw his hands tremble slightly. I nodded. "I understand. But I can't control it." He came closer, so close that I could feel his breath. At that moment, the world around us disappeared. There were only the two of us and the bridge we had already begun to cross. "We have to stop," he said, but his hand was already touching my cheek. I didn't pull away. Instead, I felt my fingers find his hand. This moment, this contact seemed inevitable. Everything that had happened before led us here. His lips were as warm as his embrace. When he pulled me closer, I felt the last boundary we tried to maintain disappear. When the boundary was crossed, I thought the tension would ease, that I would find peace inside. But instead, everything became more complicated. Now, instead of trying to ignore our feelings, we found ourselves immersed in a world full of passion and danger. Every moment we were alone became a test. We both knew this couldn't continue, but we couldn't do anything about it. The next day, I came out of my room, feeling my whole body trembling from what had happened the night before. Dad was already in the kitchen as usual. He was trying to act as if everything was normal, but his movements were sharp, as if he was fighting inner demons. "Morning," I mumbled, sitting down at the table. "Morning," he replied without looking up. We both were silent, as if afraid that words would destroy the fragile balance we were trying to maintain. But this balance was illusory. We both knew it. After breakfast, he went to the garage, and I was left alone in the house. I tried to keep busy to distract myself, but thoughts of him kept coming back. I felt my attachment to him becoming something more than I could control. Later that evening, I heard him come back into the house. His steps were heavy, and he looked tired when he entered the living room. I was sitting on the couch pretending to read a book, but really waiting for him. "Long day?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He nodded, sitting down next to me. His presence was palpable, almost scorching. Our eyes met and I felt my heart race. "Ellie," he began but fell silent. His voice sounded as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I didn't let him finish. "You don't have to feel guilty," I said softly. I wanted it too. His eyes met mine, full of confusion and pain. "But it's wrong," he whispered. "Do you understand what we're doing?" "Yes, I understand," I replied, feeling my emotions overwhelm me. "But I can't stop it. And neither can you." We both fell silent. The room was filled with silence, broken only by our uneven breathing. I knew we had gone too far to turn back. Our feelings, forbidden and destructive, had consumed us completely. The following days turned into a strange dance between passion and guilt. We tried to avoid each other, but every time we were alone, it all came back. One evening became the culmination. I was preparing dinner and he was standing next to me, helping. Our hands accidentally touched, and this simple contact triggered a wave of emotions that couldn't be contained. He pulled me to him, his lips found mine, and at that moment the whole world disappeared. All that existed was us. Every touch was filled with desperation and passion, as if we understood that this might be the last time. But despite the moments of passion, guilt gnawed at us both. At night, lying in my room, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were doing something terrible. I saw his eyes full of contradictions when he looked at me. He was trying to restrain himself, but it was pointless. "We can't keep doing this," he said one night when we were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. His voice was soft but resolute. "I know," I whispered, "but I can't stop." He looked at me, his eyes full of pain. "This is destroying us both, Ellie. We'll lose everything if this continues." Those words stuck in my head. He was right. We were playing with fire, and this fire was ready to consume us. But even knowing this, I couldn't stop. Every time he entered the room, my heart skipped a beat. Every touch, every look only intensified my feelings. I knew we were moving toward the edge, but I couldn't turn back. When everything fell apart, it happened suddenly. We were playing with fire, and it burned us to the ground. I always thought I could control my feelings, that I could find a way to leave everything as it was. But I was wrong. We both were wrong. It was an ordinary day. I was sitting at the kitchen table pretending to read a book, though my thoughts were elsewhere. Dad came into the room, and I felt the familiar tension that now accompanied us every time we were alone. He came closer, looking at me with concern. "Ellie," he began, but his voice was trembling. I looked up at him. "What's wrong?" "We can't live like this anymore," he said finally. His words were like a knife, plunging into my heart. "What do you mean?" I knew what he meant, but I wanted to hear it from him. He sat down across from me, his hands nervously intertwined. "This is wrong. Everything we've done. We've gone too far, Ellie. We have to stop before it's too late to save anything." I was silent, trying to digest his words. I knew he was right, but these words caused pain, tearing me apart inside. "Do you think I don't know that?" I finally said, my voice full of bitterness. "Do you think I don't feel how this is destroying us?" He looked at me, his eyes full of guilt and pain. "I don't know how to stop this," he said softly. "But we have to try. For you. For us." From that day on, our relationship began to change. We tried to avoid each other, to keep our distance. Every time our eyes met, I saw the struggle in his. He was trying to be the father he had always been to me, but the shadow of what we had done stood between us. I began to feel something inside me breaking. These days, when I sat alone in my room, were filled with despair and emptiness. I knew our relationship would never be the same again. We had crossed a boundary, and there was no way back. One day, I heard him talking on the phone. His voice was low and tense. I quietly approached, not wanting to eavesdrop, but unable to stop myself. "I don't know what to do," he said. "I'm afraid this will destroy us both. But I can't just forget." My eyes filled with tears. I realized he was suffering just as much as I was. These feelings we tried to suppress continued to tear us apart inside. A few days later, he suggested I leave. "You need to go back to university, Ellie," he said, avoiding my gaze. "You need to start a new life. Far away from all this." "You want me to leave?" I asked, feeling my chest tighten. "I want you to be happy," he replied. "And here you can't achieve that." I didn't know what to say. His words were right, but they still cut deep. I knew he was trying to save us both, but it felt like a betrayal. When I was packing my things, he stood in the doorway watching me. His face was tense, as if he was fighting something inside. When I finished, he came closer. "Ellie, I want you to know that I'll always be here. If you need anything, I'll be here," he said. I nodded but said nothing. My heart was too broken to find words. The next day I left. As the car pulled out of the driveway, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw him. He was standing on the porch, his eyes full of pain. It was the last time I saw him like that. Months have passed, but I still feel his presence. Those moments we shared remain with me like burns that will never heal. Sometimes I ask myself, could I have done something differently? Could we have found another way? I understand that our connection was a mistake, but at that moment it seemed like the only right thing. It destroyed us, but it also showed me how strong emotions can be. Now, as I write this, I want to remind myself. Sometimes you have to let go, even if it seems impossible. Love, no matter how strong, is not always right. It can destroy like a fire that warms but leaves only ashes. We both suffered, but perhaps it was necessary. Perhaps this pain was part of the path we had to take. And now I continue to live, trying to find peace. But I will never forget the one who was everything to me. Father, friend, and for a moment something more than I could allow myself.